First, I'd like to take a moment to commemorate what happened in New Hope last night and express my gratitude to the courageous law enforcement officers who risked their lives to protect the city council members and other attendees. And I just wish there was an answer to this kind of madness that's going on in this state, in this country. But I'm glad there are courageous people who are willing to step forward in those times of crisis and protect other innocent people's lives. So let me just put into brief context this fairly elaborate presentation. It's taken a lot of work to distill it down to what is hopefully understandable given all the complexities inherent in a budget of over $40 billion. And it's important to look at today's focus on the additional expenditures dealing with the $1,037 million surplus in the context of the last official budget forecast that was issued last November, which projected that surplus, but all of those numbers and the increases that are reflected in them are not shown up in the recommendations that we're highlighting here today. I also would note that it does not include either the reserve fund or the cash flow account, which together total $1.344 billion, which is an increase of $343 million from the previous biennium due to the legislative actions last year. And of that 1.037 biennial surplus, I'm proposing to spend over 50% of it on our children from age of birth through age 18, for $418 million of expenditures and another $100 million in the child dependency tax credit, which I outlined previously. So over half of this surplus goes into our future, into the young people who will comprise the future of Minnesota, and that investment, along with the transportation investments that I proposed yesterday, are placing my major priority on the future of Minnesota in education and transportation. There's also additional money for higher education as well as for health and human services, so that in total 75% of the proposed budget increase goes to the young, the elderly, and people with disabilities. And I think that's an appropriate priority. Commissioners Cassellius and Jessen will be detailing those additional expenditures in a few minutes. And I will just note a couple of items that stand out in this, in the myriad of all the other details, that the $93 million of additional spending that I'm proposing for higher education includes additional student aid, additional funding for the University of Minnesota, both for its base budget, which I hope will go to reducing any tuition increases, and also, as I detailed last week, for the University of Minnesota Medical School. My budget withholds new investments for MnSCU until the current dispute between faculty and management is resolved. I've communicated that to the various parties and have received assurances that they're expect to make considerable progress before the supplemental budget after the next forecast, the end of February. And it's my hope that I'll be able to restore the additional funding request for the MnSCU at that time. Also, I want to note, since I made it a priority in the past, that there's no additional funding proposed for special education, which continues to be one of my top education priorities. But there is in the base budget an 11% increase in special ed funding for the next biennium, 16-17, over the previous biennium, which is already built into the base due to the changes that were made in the last legislative sessions. Another noteworthy item is the absence of additional funding in my proposal for nursing homes. In the 2013 legislative session, nursing home received an 8.2% increase over the 2 years, which is reflected in the 16-17 base. This includes a 5% increase in September 2013, an additional 3.2% in October of 15. That will take effect in October of 15. In the last legislative session, additionally, there was another $5 million provided to help nursing homes adjust to the new minimum wage, and another $4.5 million for rural nursing homes. So over the total 4 years of this biennium and the next one, those increases have provided more than $93 million in higher payments for nursing homes in Minnesota. So I certainly share the concern of legislators and nursing home providers that their additional costs be reflected with this additional state funding. Regarding the Minneapolis Park Board, and I've been notified, the new chair of the Metropolitan Council has notified the chair of the Minneapolis Park Board that my recommendation is that the Met Council will receive general fund and natural resources funds, reducing the amount and bill language to accomplish this, to eliminate the Minneapolis Park Board as a recipient of those funds in the next biennium. It totals $1.26 million in general fund reduction, $2.51 million in natural resources fund reduction, for a total of $3.77 million total reduction in their operating budgets. It does not reflect any change in the bonding bill that I expect to be offering in a few weeks. The change item page says the governor recommends a reduction in funding to the Minneapolis Park Board due to the board's continuing efforts to obstruct progress on the Southwest Light Rail Transit project. Speaking of rail, there's a item in the tax segment of the proposal here that will modernize railroad property taxes in Minnesota, and that those additional revenues would be directed to help the state and cities, counties, and townships deal with the added costs of the increased rail traffic going through our state. These are primarily changes in the property tax laws that are outdated, haven't kept pace with increased rail uses. And it's a way of asking the rail industry, as they should be asked, to contribute more of their fair share to correcting the deficiencies in the system, which are being accentuated by this additional rail traffic. It'll provide increased revenue, to, as I said before, to counties, cities, townships, as well as the state of Minnesota, to invest in strengthening rail safety across the state, and will provide that, it will avoid that tax burden being shifted to homeowners, businesses, farmers through additional property taxes. I intend to propose in my bonding bill in a few weeks about $42 million of bonding for 3 essential upgrades of rail crossings for Prairie Island, for Moorhead, and for Wilmer. And the additional money that's being proposed to be raised over the next biennium would go to help offset the costs of the additional improvements at rail crossings for those where the actual separation is at this point either not planned or is cost prohibitive. So those are some of the highlights as I see it, and I'll be available for questions after Commissioner France and Commissioner Casselli, Commissioner Justin have a chance to outline in further detail some of these proposals.